Most officers serve with honor, but a few have betrayed the public trust in the worst ways possible, from brutal murders to organized crime. These 10 dirty cops crossed the line and paid the price. Stay with us as we reveal their shocking stories, the damning evidence, and the sentences that brought them to justice. Kicking off our top 10 is Tamika Johnson, whose shocking actions defied all expectations and set the stage for a gripping story of crime and consequence.
That CHP officer is behind bars, charged with murdering her husband.
Tamika Johnson, a California Highway Patrol officer, found herself in a tragic situation in February 2009 when she shot and killed her husband, Marcus Lemons, while on a freeway exit ramp. After the shooting, Tamika drove to her parents' home with Marcus's body in the front seat of her car. When questioned by detectives, Tamika provided them with a detailed account of what led to the incident. According to Tamika, she and her husband started their night out at TGI Fridays, but an argument soon erupted. Tamika stated that she took the car keys and started to drive home, attempting to ignore the escalating tensions between her and Marcus. However, Marcus became enraged when she ignored him, grabbing her neck. Tamika claimed she pulled over on the freeway, hoping to calm down and defuse the situation. However, the struggle continued as Marcus took the keys out of the ignition, and a fight over Tamika's purse ensued. Tamika believed that Marcus was going for the gun she carried in her bag, and in self-defense, she managed to get hold of the weapon and shoot Marcus. However, after a thorough investigation, the detectives came to the conclusion that Tamika's story was not one of self-defense. Instead, they suspected it was cold-blooded murder. 2 years after her husband's death, Tamika Johnson was arrested and charged with murder. She pleaded not guilty and was held on a $2 million bail as she awaited trial. Due to her arrest, Tamika was placed on administrative leave without pay from her position as a California Highway Patrol officer. During Tamika's trial, her defense attorneys attempted to present her as a victim of domestic violence, not as someone who committed a callous act of murder. However, the prosecution countered these claims by presenting evidence that Tamika had exhibited aggressive tendencies and a tendency to drink excessively. Additionally, the prosecution painted the victim, Marcus, as a kind and peaceful man. Tamika took the witness stand to testify in her defense, but her statements did little to sway the jury. The jury ultimately found her guilty of first-degree murder, sentencing her to 50 years to life in prison. After the verdict was read, Tamika slid out of her chair behind the defense table and onto the floor. She was handcuffed to a gurney rail by her left wrist and removed from the courtroom as her family wailed and sobbed. At number 9, Jeffrey Moreland carried out a chillingly calculated plan that will leave you questioning just how far someone will go.
Several people took the stand today, including Carrick Roberts' husband and the detective who described to the jury the red flags that he knew pointed to murder.
On November 5, 2008, Carrick Roberts, a happily married woman with 2 children, was discovered fatally shot in her home. The scene was gruesome, as Kara had been assaulted before her murder. Her killer had meticulously planned the killing, leaving Kara's body in the bathtub with the water running. An investigation into Kara's murder was swiftly launched, but the case soon became a cold one. The police, fearing there was a serial killer stalking the streets, grew concerned that the person who murdered Kara would strike again. Their fears were justified, as 2 years later, in October 2010, another heinous crime occurred. In October 2010, Paige Husser went to check on her 75-year-old mother, Nina Whitley, after not hearing from her for a while. When Paige entered her mother's home, she found Nina dead at the bottom of the stairs. Initially, Paige believed that her mother must have died from a heart attack and accidentally fallen down the stairs. However, upon the arrival of the police and upon turning Nina's body over, it was evident that her death was not of natural causes. Nina had sustained several stab wounds to her chest, and there were indications that she had been sexually assaulted. Police officers began canvassing the neighborhood where Nina lived, seeking any clues or witness accounts that might help them identify the killer. One resident who had seen a white male in his 50s walking with a limp and driving a black Jeep near Nina's house on the day of her murder provided valuable information to the police. This witness was able to give a detailed description of the man, which assisted the police sketch artist in creating a likeness of the suspect. DNA evidence recovered from Nina's body was sent to the crime lab for analysis. Although detectives failed to find a suspect, the DNA did match the DNA found at the crime scene of Carrick Roberts in 2008. Initially, Nina's daughter, Paige, did not recognize the suspect in the composite sketch. However, one day, while passing by a billboard displaying the police sketch, Paige's recognition hit her. The person depicted in the sketch was none other than her former boyfriend, Jeffrey Moreland. Paige and Jeffrey dated for 3 years after meeting in a criminal justice course in college, but their relationship ended in 1987. Since their breakup, Jeffrey pursued a career in law enforcement. He became a police officer and eventually retired in 2005. The detectives quickly realized the significance of Paige's revelation and began investigating Jeffrey Moreland as a suspect in Nina's murder. One of the key discoveries they made was that Jeffrey owned a black Jeep, the same color as the vehicle driven by the suspect at the time of the crime. This evidence further solidified their suspicions and prompted them to seek a DNA sample from Jeffrey himself. Jeffrey seemed reluctant to provide a DNA sample, delaying the request from the detectives. However, as the investigation progressed, Jeffrey found himself facing allegations of sexual assault. This turn of events provided an opportunity for the detectives to obtain Jeffrey's DNA through other means. Once the DNA was analyzed, it was found to match the unknown male DNA found at both Nina Whitney's and Kara Jo Roberts' crime scenes. This development strengthened the case against Jeffrey Moreland, as it provided a direct link between him and both the murders. Jeffrey Moreland was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder and sexual assault. He faced trial and was ultimately found guilty on all counts. As a result, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At number 8, Michael Dotro unleashed a nightmare, firebombing a family as they slept peacefully, shattering lives in a single horrifying act.
The sentence to be imposed in this particular case is because Mr. Dotro, through his conduct and his admissions, spanning from 1998 to this year, represents the worst that we can possibly expect from someone in our society.
Michael Dotro, a police officer, harbored deep resentment towards his superior deputy chief, Mark Anderko. He was frustrated by the chief's decision to rearrange his shift times and order him to undergo an evaluation with a clinical psychologist, following the 11th excessive force complaint against him. In retaliation, Michael Dotro decided to take matters into his own hands. Late at night, as Mark Anderko and his family slept peacefully in their home, Michael Dotro carried out a chilling act of violence. Michael intentionally firebombed Mark's home, causing extensive damage to the property. Miraculously, everyone managed to escape alive, narrowly avoiding what could have been a tragic loss of life. Michael Dotro was arrested and taken into custody, facing an array of criminal charges. He had been accused of cyberbullying a woman who worked in the police department, slashing her tires, using the department's computer to access information illegally, and possessing marijuana and paraphernalia in his police bag. Furthermore, it was discovered that Michael had prohibited weapons in his possession, including a blackjack and brass knuckles. The prosecutor at Michael Dotro's trial delivered a powerful opening statement, calling the defendant's actions a disgrace to the oath he took as a police officer. According to the prosecution, during the hearing, Michael showed no remorse and offered no apology to his former superior, Mark Anderko, whose entire family was victimized. During the sentencing hearing, the judge handed down a stringent punishment. Michael was sentenced to 20 years for attempted murder and 10 years in prison for aggravated arson. Additionally, he received 10 years for official misconduct, 5 years for conspiracy to tamper with a witness, and 18 months for conspiracy to retaliate. These sentences were to be served consecutively, meaning Michael would first serve 17 years before being eligible for parole. Additionally, Michael was ordered to serve 5 years probation upon his release. One day in his sentencing hearing, Michael's wife made a shocking statement to the courtroom. She referred to Michael as a manipulative monster before a sheriff officer instructed her to be quiet. At number 7, Wayne Couzens brought unimaginable horrors to the Metropolitan Police Department, forever staining the force with his unspeakable actions.
A wholly blameless victim of grotesquely executed crimes, Sarah Eberhart's final hours said the judge as bleak and agonizing as it's possible to imagine.
In the case of Wayne Couzens, you would not expect what he did under the umbrella of being a cop. It will chill you to your bones. Wayne was a metropolitan officer who was arrested and suspected of kidnapping and murder. In South London, England, 33-year-old Sarah Eberhart was kidnapped on the 3rd of March, 2021. She had been walking home from a friend's house without knowing she was being followed by a white car. This car had been rented by Couzens from a dealership earlier that morning in Kent. Dashcam footage showed Couzens parking near Sarah and the two standing beside the car. As it turns out, Couzens showed Sarah his police warrant card before handcuffing her and pretending to arrest her for breaching COVID-19 guidelines. The next time the car was spotted, it was captured by CCTV around Kent. Later that night, it is believed that Couzens transferred Sarah to a different car in Shepherdswell and her there. After doing this, he strangled her with his police duty belt. The next time he was seen, Couzens had once again switched to his rental car and drove to a gas station where he was seen buying gas, big builder bags, and duct tape. It seemed like he decided to get rid of Sarah. Couzens then burnt Sarah's body in a refrigerator and dumped her remains in a pond near Couzens' part of his family's property in Hodes Wood, Ashford. On the 8th of March, Couzens turned in his handcuffs and police belt after saying he was suffering from stress. He was arrested on the 9th of March because he was the last person who saw Sarah. She had called her boyfriend before Couzens kidnapped and murdered her. Her boyfriend contacted the police and the search identified Couzens as the primary suspect in her murder.
I'll show you a picture. Do you know Sarah?
I don't know.
Okay.
For a while, Couzens repeatedly denied ever having interactions with Sarah, even though they showed him a picture of the victim. The officers in charge of the investigation were convinced that Wayne was their culprit, so they pressed further. What Couzens said after their persistence would shock you.
I am in financial and I've been lent on by I don't know who they are. They're a group, a gang, whatever, and they told me, right, I need to go and pick up girls and give them to them.
Couzens claimed that he had paid for sex in Folkestone, and as payment, a gang of Eastern Europeans had threatened to harm his family unless he gave them another girl because he had underpaid a sex worker a few weeks before kidnapping Sarah. He claimed that this was the reason he had kidnapped Sarah, so he could hand her over to the gang. He didn't give any defined answers to any of the questions he was asked about how the gang contacted him.
They threatened to take my family away from me. So, at that point, I'm doing what I can to protect my family.
Eventually, Couzens confessed to kidnapping and murdering Sarah Eberhart on June 8, 2021. He was sentenced in September to life in prison with the tariff of a whole life order, meaning there was no way he would ever be released from jail. Couzens also received an extra 19 months for a previous offense of indecent exposure. The judge who sentenced Couzens said that the murder of Sarah would have been prevented if the previous sexual offenses of Couzens had been taken seriously. Couzens was said to be shaking as his sentence was read, but video evidence was never provided. As a result of this brutal murder, the Met announced that they would stop deploying lone police officers in plain clothing. Wayne Couzens' case was shocking, but nothing will make you lose faith in law enforcement faster than the horrific actions of Nouman Raja at number 6, which rocked the entire community.
Nouman Raja, defendant, verdict. We, the jury, find as follows. As to count 1, we find a defendant guilty of manslaughter while armed with a firearm as charged in the information.
Nouman Raja, a Muslim man with Pakistani heritage, became a naturalized American citizen in 2001. Married with 2 children, Nouman had a deep desire to follow in the footsteps of his grandfather, who had served as a police chief in Pakistan. After years of working in a small police department in Florida, Nouman left his post in 2013 and joined the Palm Beach Gardens Police Department. On October 18, 2015, Corey Jones, an employee of the Delray Beach Housing Authority, found himself in a difficult situation. After completing a gig with his band, Corey's vehicle broke down on Interstate 94. Frustrated and in need of assistance, Corey called his bandmate, who arrived promptly with the necessary oil to refill the car. Despite their efforts, Corey and his bandmate were unable to start the vehicle. Corey called for a tow truck, and his bandmate left, sure that Corey would get home safely. Little did they know that Corey's life was about to take a tragic turn. As the night unfolded, Nouman, working as a plainclothes police officer in an unmarked white van with tinted windows, came across Corey's vehicle. Nouman, who was conducting burglary surveillance, claimed that Corey, who was armed, confronted him. According to Nouman's account, the situation left him with no choice but to discharge his weapon. With 6 shots being fired, Corey was hit with 3 bullets. One of the bullets struck a major blood vessel near his heart, ultimately leading to his death. The other 2 bullets hit Corey in his left elbow and right shoulder, breaking his arm from the impact. At the time, Nouman was not wearing a body camera, nor did he have his vehicle equipped with a dash cam. Internal Affairs with the Palm Beach Gardens Police Department launched an investigation into Corey's death, resulting in Nouman being placed on administrative leave and later terminated from his job. On June 1, 2016, a grand jury charged Nouman with manslaughter and attempted first-degree murder with a firearm. The state attorney's office of Palm Beach County alleged that Nouman had acted wrongfully when he opened fire at Corey, as Nouman never identified himself as a police officer. The state attorney's office argued that Nouman's actions were unjustified and led to Corey's death. Nouman was released on bond following his arrest and placed on house arrest. One of his conditions of release required him to hand over his passport and wear an ankle monitor to track his movements. In March 2019, a jury found Nouman guilty of manslaughter and attempted first-degree murder following a trial that lasted for a week. The jury found Nouman guilty of recklessly causing Corey's death and trying to kill him with a firearm. Nouman was sentenced to 25 years in prison the following month. Following the trial, Corey's family filed a wrongful death suit against the city of Palm Beach Gardens. The suit aimed to hold the city accountable for allowing Nouman to serve in a position of authority as a corrupt cop. Corey's family believed that the city's negligence had contributed to Corey's death, and they hoped to obtain justice through the legal system. Coming in at number 5 is Kenneth Blue, who stole what should have been a joyful time from the mother of his child in the most devastating way.
Blue is charged on 4 counts, including first-degree premeditated murder in the strangulation death of Jenny Webb, the Bridgeport woman bearing his unborn child.
In 2012, Jennifer Webb, a 30-year-old administrative assistant from Michigan, made an exciting discovery. She was pregnant. The news filled her with joy and anticipation, especially when the sonogram test revealed that she was going to have a little boy. Jennifer promptly shared her happiness with her mother, calling her in tears to announce her plans to name her unborn son James or Braxton. Despite the joyous news, Jennifer's pregnancy faced one important challenge. The father of the child was not involved, and she had concerns about whether she had shared the news with his wife. Jennifer believed it was crucial for the baby's birth certificate to include the birth father's name, and she felt the man's wife ought to know beforehand. Wanting to address these concerns, Jennifer planned to meet with the baby's father on the evening of August 30th. That night, Jennifer was annoyed by the impending meeting. However, she ultimately decided to go anyway, a decision that would change her life forever. At around midnight, 2 police officers with the Buena Vista Township Police Department, one of them being Kenneth Blue, stumbled upon a gruesome discovery. As they approached the rural dead-end road, they found Jennifer lying on the ground. Upon closer inspection, the officers noticed a peculiar sight. A long cord was attached to the roof rack of Jennifer's car and extended down the ditch to where her body lay. Even more chilling was the fact that the cord was wrapped tightly around her neck. Recognizing the severity of the situation, the detectives wasted no time launching an investigation. They quickly secured the crime scene and began searching for clues that could shed light on what happened to Jennifer. One of the detectives stumbled upon a note written by Jennifer. The note revealed her thoughts on taking her own life. It stated that she had struggled with the idea of being pregnant for several months and had finally admitted to herself that she was not okay with the situation. When the detectives questioned Jennifer's mother, she dropped a bombshell. The father of Jennifer's baby was Kenneth Blue, one of the police officers who found Jennifer's body. This revelation sparked a chain of events that led the detectives to uncover new details about the case. As the investigation continued, the detectives stumbled upon messages between Jennifer and Kenneth Blue on Jennifer's cell phone. These messages provided further insight into their relationship and revealed their intimate connection. Moreover, when they examined Jennifer's call log, the detectives noticed the last person she had contact with was Kenneth. In order to determine the manner of Jennifer's death, a forensic pathologist was called in. The pathologist's findings contradicted the initial assumption that an extension cord strangled Jennifer. Instead, the pathologist determined that Jennifer may have been placed in a chokehold from behind and died as a result of neck compression.
She died of the suffocation. We call it chokehold.
This new information cast doubt on the initial crime scene analysis, indicating that the death may not have been as straightforward as initially thought. During an interview with Kenneth Blue, the detectives noticed several injuries on the officer's body. There were noticeable injuries to his eye, forearm, and index finger. When the DNA results of the paternity of Jennifer's unborn baby confirmed the father was Officer Kenneth Blue, the detectives wasted no time in arresting him and charging him with Jennifer and her unborn son's murder. In 2012, Kenneth Blue went on trial and was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Additionally, he was given an extra 65 to 100-year sentence for the death of his unborn son. During Jennifer's mother's victim impact statement, she had the opportunity to address Kenneth Blue directly. With a mix of anger and sadness, she said,
"Go to your cage and think about how you squeezed the life and breath out of my daughter and grandson, and I hope it haunts you every day for the rest of your life."
Sitting at number 4 is Wayne Jenkins, a dirty cop who took corruption to shocking new heights.
A judge sentenced Sergeant Wayne Jenkins to 25 years in federal prison.
You have a gun in probably, I would say 2 1/4 just by looking at it.
Imagine a case being so wild that HBO had to make a 6-part series about it. A chilling discovery was made inside the Baltimore Police Department. 8 police officers were deep into running an organized crime ring. The level of deep corruption was led by our perpetrator, Wayne Jenkins. Wayne Jenkins was the head of the Gun Trace Task Force, responsible for a few unexpected crimes of a police officer. He was responsible for planting evidence, running robberies, and stealing drugs from looted pharmaceutical companies.
Newly released videos show the officers pretending to open a safe for the first time.
"Hey, Sarge! Hey, come downstairs right quick. They're about to get it open."
But in fact, prosecutors say they'd already gotten in, took $100,000 for themselves, then pretended this was the first time they'd laid eyes on the cash.
The intention behind creating this task force wasn't what it was being used for at all. Jenkins and his crew robbed people at gunpoint, stole and sold drugs, making more than $1 million in the process. That was not all, because to the list of his crimes, he caused the loss of lives. In a recovered body camera footage, Jenkins and his team were seen attempting to rob 2 men in a car, which caused the men to run. Jenkins chased the car until he hit the car, causing the death of Albert Davis. The action of Jenkins and his team dealt a huge blow to the victims' families. The daughter of Davis was asked 7 years after this incident if she could ever trust the police again after what happened to her father. Here is what his daughter had to say about it.
7 years later, we find out that corrupt cops who swore to protect and serve were nothing more than criminals. He apologized for it, Mr. Jenkins, but it still hurts.
This isn't the worst of it, so we have to ask questions. How did years of organized crime go unnoticed in the police force? And how were they finally exposed? Quite shockingly, one man led to the unraveling of this life of crime. A man was convicted after he sold the heroin that killed a teenager. After evidence was admitted, it was discovered from the wiretaps that the voices of the 8 men, including Jenkins and his team, were heard constantly during conversations. Upon further investigations, it was discovered that this task force had been involved in a drug deal, and there was nothing about them that was law-like. In this case, it had been one of the task force members, Mamadou Gondo, who had been protecting the drug crew so they could build their illegal business into $1 million enterprise. Besides these recordings, there were also discoveries of irregular official records that looked like they were tampered with. With the overwhelming amount of evidence stacked against this corrupt task force, the FBI had enough to arrest and indict them. Wayne Jenkins was finally tried and he was sentenced to 25 years in prison on June 7, 2018. It was said that he cried during his sentencing and asked the judge for mercy. He had earlier told an attorney that he could not go to prison for life because of his children. His lawyer also said he showed signs of remorse, and he reportedly told the judge he was ashamed of what he had done. Marcus Eberhart sits in the number 3 spot, igniting a nationwide debate with his shocking actions.
Sergeant Eberhart guilty on all counts and Corporal Weems guilty of involuntary manslaughter, reckless conduct, and oaths of office. Now, the 2 were accused of tasing 24-year-old Gregory Towns to death back in April of 2014.
This is Marcus Eberhart, a former police officer from East Point, Michigan, who launched the world into a debate in 2014 when he and another officer, Howard Weems, tasered 24-year-old Gregory Towns to death. On April 11, 2014, the 2 ex-officers responded to a report about domestic violence from Towns' girlfriend, Aisha Smith. She had called the police with claims that Towns had abused her, so Eberhart and Weems went to the house. According to testimony, Towns had tried to run away from the police after he saw them, and as a result, he was caught and handcuffed. He was then instructed by Eberhart to walk to the car. Towns claimed that he was too tired to walk to the car. Subsequently, Eberhart and Weems used their tasers on Towns repeatedly until he became unresponsive. The intention was to get Towns to cooperate with them, but it resulted in him getting murdered. The prosecution called the act a violation because at the time the two officers tasered Towns, he was already handcuffed and he was having a hard time breathing. At first, it was said that it wasn't the taser that killed him, but the fact that Gregory Towns had an underlying health condition, a rare sickle cell trait, which just happened to be an unfortunate coincidence. Eberhart was eventually charged with involuntary manslaughter and felony murder because of this incident. From past records, it was shown that Eberhart was an aggressive officer. During the investigation, it was revealed that Eberhart had used the taser on Towns for more than 40 seconds, which is longer than departmental policy allows. The defense claimed that Eberhart didn't know about Towns' health conditions and only used his taser per his training because Towns was resisting arrest. Marcus was eventually charged for this death, and it became the first time in the history of Michigan that a police officer had been convicted of a crime for using a taser on an individual. Eberhart was eventually sentenced in December 2016. During the verdict, where he was told that he could be facing up to 15 years in jail, Eberhart seemed really interested in leaving the courthouse and did not show any form of emotion or reaction during the verdict. His lawyer said he was disappointed in what Eberhart had done, but other than that, nothing else. Eventually, Eberhart was sentenced to life in prison for what he did. He didn't say anything that was recorded, but it was said that he released a statement where he expressed remorse for his actions. He also said that he knew and understood the impact of what he did on Gregory's girlfriend and child. He said, "I'm truly sorry for the pain that I have caused the Marshall family. I am aware of the fact that nothing I can say or do can bring back their loved one." This case drew the spotlight on the use of force and aggression by police officers and the lack of accountability when cops violate departmental policy. Towns' family was relieved that Eberhart was held accountable for what he did. Aisha Smith said that she would learn to live with herself and not blame herself for calling Eberhart and Weems to the house, which consequently led to the death of Gregory Towns. We're almost at number 1, but David Carrick takes the number 2 spot for a long and disturbing history of offenses dating back to 2003.
This is the allegation that's been made to us, okay, sir?
There's no necessity.
Yes, there is.
It's like I've been a police officer for 20 years.
And in many ways, this is a story of the strength of 12 women. When this arrest made the news in 2021, those impacted started to come forward.
By day, he wore a badge. By night, he was a predator. His story is a stark reminder that monsters can hide in plain sight, even behind a uniform. Carrick joined the Met Police in 2001 after a stint in the Army. He seemed like the perfect candidate, disciplined, dedicated, and eager to serve. Little did anyone know, this was the beginning of a reign of terror that would span nearly 2 decades. His first known offense dates back to 2003. Over the next 17 years, Carrick would go on to commit a series of horrific crimes against at least 12 women. His methods were consistent and cruel. He'd meet women on dating apps or in bars, using his status as a police officer to gain their trust. One victim recalled how Carrick bragged about guarding Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Another remembered him showing off his warrant card on their first date. These weren't just pickup lines. They were calculated moves to lower his victims' defenses. Once alone with his victims, Carrick's true nature emerged. He'd become controlling and violent. Women reported being locked in small cupboards under the stairs for hours. Some were urinated on, beaten, and assaulted. One victim was attacked with an adult toy so violently she had to seek medical attention. Carrick's crimes weren't limited to physical abuse. He employed psychological tactics too. He'd tell his victims they were worthless, that no one would believe them over a police officer. He isolated them from friends and family, controlled their finances, and monitored their movements. In one particularly harrowing incident, Carrick held a gun to a woman's head. The message was clear. He had the power of life and death over her. Despite the severity and frequency of his crimes, Carrick managed to evade justice for years. How? The answer lies in a toxic mix of institutional failings and the power of the badge he carried. Between 2000 and 2021, Carrick was the subject of multiple complaints. There were accusations of domestic violence, harassment, and assault. Yet, time and again, he faced no serious consequences. Internal investigations were dropped. Criminal complaints didn't make it to court.
He was accused of harassing an ex-partner. No action was taken. Over the next 6 years, he raped several women.
In 2021, everything changed. A woman came forward with an allegation against Carrick. This time, the complaint stuck. As news of his arrest spread, more victims found the courage to speak out. The floodgates opened, and the true extent of Carrick's crimes began to emerge. The investigation that followed uncovered a pattern of behavior so shocking it sent shockwaves through the entire Metropolitan Police Force. Detectives pieced together a timeline of abuse spanning nearly 2 decades. The sheer scale of Carrick's offenses was staggering. As the case built against him, disturbing details about Carrick's personality came to light. Colleagues described him as cocky and a womanizer. He was known to brag about his sexual conquests, often in degrading terms. In retrospect, these were red flags that had been ignored for far too long. The investigation also revealed Carrick's fascination with weaponry. Beyond his service firearm, he owned a collection of legally held guns. This arsenal added an extra layer of intimidation to his interactions with victims. By the time the case reached court, the evidence against Carrick was overwhelming. DNA evidence, witness testimonies, and digital footprints all pointed to his guilt. The man who had hidden behind his badge for so long was finally exposed. Now let's rewind to January 2023. Carrick stands in the dock at London's Southwark Crown Court. The air is thick with tension. Victims, their families, and fellow officers pack the room. As the charges are read, gasps echo through the courtroom. Each count feels like a punch to the gut for those present. 49 charges, 24 rapes. Crimes spanning 17 years. Each detail is more horrifying than the last. Carrick used his position to gain trust, then shattered it in the worst ways possible. The courtroom listens in stunned silence as the prosecutor outlines a pattern of behavior so twisted, it's hard to comprehend. But how did he evade justice for so long? That's where this case gets even darker. Carrick's job as a firearms officer in an elite unit gave him a shield of authority. He wasn't just any cop. He was part of the Parliamentary and Diplomatic Protection Command. This prestigious position allowed him to brush off complaints and intimidate victims. As the prosecutor speaks, eyes dart between Carrick and the judge. The former officer stands motionless, his face a mask of indifference. But the courtroom? It's a powder keg of emotions. Anger, disgust, and a deep sense of betrayal fill the air. Victims' impact statements cut through the silence. Words like monster and pure evil hang in the air. One survivor describes feeling worthless. Another speaks of nightmares that never end. A third recounts how Carrick's actions destroyed her faith in the police, the very institution meant to protect her.
I don't trust the police anymore. My anxiety now affects all aspects of my life, and I struggle to go anywhere on my own.
What happened to me broke me. I was whipped, urinated on, and locked naked in a cupboard. I was told I was worthless and would be better off dead.
The weight of their pain is obvious. Some in the courtroom weep openly. Others clench their fists, barely containing their rage. The collective trauma in the room is overwhelming, a testament to the far-reaching impact of Carrick's crimes.
Before we begin, Alice's hands tremble. This is so hard for her, but she's clear about why she's sharing her story.
I didn't want to be known as a rape victim.
Then, a twist. Carrick's own lawyer paints a picture of a broken man, claiming childhood trauma led to his crimes. The courtroom bristles. Is this an explanation or an excuse? The defense argues that Carrick's upbringing in an abusive household warped his view of relationships. They point to his alcoholism and depression as mitigating factors. But for many, these arguments fall flat. The prosecution quickly counters, reminding the court of Carrick's calculated behavior. This wasn't a man out of control, they argue, but one who carefully selected his victims and used his position to silence them. As the judge prepares to deliver the sentence, the atmosphere shifts. This moment, years in the making, will determine if justice truly prevails. The words come like hammer blows.
This makes a total of 36 life sentences. The minimum term you will have to serve before the parole board can think of releasing you is 30 years, 239 days.
But the story doesn't end here. As Carrick is led away, whispers start. How many others like him are still out there? How deep does this problem go in the police force? The case has exposed serious flaws in the vetting process for police officers. Carrick had faced multiple complaints over the years, yet remained on the force. This revelation sends shockwaves through the criminal justice system. Calls for reform echo beyond the courtroom walls.
He was vetted again and passed. In 2019, he allegedly assaulted a woman in Hertfordshire. He got a mild reprimand and the matter was dropped.
In the days following the sentencing, public outrage grows. Protests erupt outside police stations. Demands for accountability reach fever pitch. The Met Police, already under scrutiny, faces a crisis of confidence.
We can't rely on the police to protect us from violence against women, which is one of the most prevalent crimes in our society.
Political leaders weigh in, promising investigations and changes. But for many, these words ring hollow. The damage to public trust is deep and may take years to repair.
All I can say is, I'm sorry that we've let you down.
The media frenzy surrounding the case brings other victims forward. Women who had stayed silent, fearing they wouldn't be believed, now find the courage to speak out. It becomes clear that Carrick's case, as horrifying as it is, might just be the tip of the iceberg. Support groups for victims of police abuse see a surge in calls. Mental health professionals warn of the long-lasting impact on not just Carrick's direct victims, but on public perception of law enforcement as a whole. Legal experts begin to re-examine old cases, looking for signs of similar abuse of power. The ripple effects of Carrick's crimes spread far and wide, touching every corner of the criminal justice system. As the dust settles, attention turns to prevention. How can we stop another David Carrick? Proposals range from enhanced psychological screening for officers to independent oversight committees. But implementing these changes proves challenging, met with resistance from some within the police force itself. The case also sparks a broader conversation about power dynamics and consent. Schools and universities update their curricula, emphasizing the importance of healthy relationships and recognizing abuse. Our number one spot goes to none other than the infamous Golden State Killer, Joseph DeAngelo, whose reign of terror needs no introduction. For years, he was a ghost, a phantom that haunted California, leaving a trail of terror, violence, and unanswered questions. Joseph James DeAngelo Jr., better known as the Golden State Killer, committed at least 13 murders and 50 across California between 1974 and 1986. His crimes went unsolved for decades, becoming one of America's most notorious cold cases. DeAngelo's reign of terror began in the mid-1970s in Visalia, California. Known then as the Visalia Ransacker, he would break into homes, vandalize personal property, and steal small items. But his crimes quickly escalated. By 1976, he had moved to the Sacramento area, where he became known as the East Area. His modus operandi was chilling. He would stalk his victims, often entering their homes beforehand to unlock windows or plant ligatures. Then, in the dead of night, he would strike. DeAngelo would wake his victims with a flashlight beam and threats of violence. He often tied up male victims and stacked dishes on their backs, warning them that if he heard the dishes fall, he'd kill everyone in the house. He would then violate the female victims, sometimes repeatedly, over hours.
He preyed on people in Carmichael, Citrus Heights, and Rancho Cordova, often targeting couples. While raping the women, he would psychologically torture their husbands, tying them up and placing dishes on their back, threatening them not to move.
As fear gripped Sacramento, DeAngelo's attacks became bolder. He began targeting couples using the same tactics of binding, threats, and assaults. In 1978, he committed his first known murders, killing Brian and Katie Maggiore in Rancho Cordova. DeAngelo then moved his hunting grounds south to the Santa Barbara area, where he became known as the original Night Stalker. Here, his violence escalated further. He murdered at least 8 more people between 1979 and 1986, including couples in their homes. One of his most brutal attacks occurred in 1980 when he murdered Charlene and Lyman Smith in their Ventura County home. Charlene was violated before both were bludgeoned to death with a fireplace log. For years, investigators didn't connect these crimes. The East Area rapist and the original Night Stalker were thought to be separate offenders. It wasn't until DNA testing in 2001 that authorities realized they were dealing with a single perpetrator. The case went cold for decades. DeAngelo, a former police officer, seemed to vanish into thin air after 1986. Victims lived in fear, never knowing if their attacker would return. Families of the murdered were left without closure, their loved ones' cases unsolved. Then, in 2018, a breakthrough came. Investigators used DNA from a crime scene and uploaded it to a genealogy website. This led them to distant relatives of the killer. Through painstaking work, they narrowed their search and finally identified Joseph DeAngelo as their suspect.
A breakthrough in 2018. Law enforcement plugged DNA material taken from a crime scene into a website called GEDmatch, which compares the genealogical data of family members.
On April 24, 2018, DeAngelo was arrested in his home in Citrus Heights, California. The man who had eluded capture for over 40 years was finally in custody. DNA evidence conclusively linked him to multiple crime scenes.
On April 24, 2018, police arrested Joseph James DeAngelo.
The arrest sent shockwaves through California and the true crime community. The Golden State Killer, a boogeyman who had haunted the state for decades, now had a face, a name, and a backstory that seemed jarringly ordinary. As details of DeAngelo's life emerged, the contrast was stark. He had worked as a police officer in Exeter and Auburn, California during the 1970s. He had been married, raised 3 daughters, and lived a seemingly normal life in the same area he had once terrorized. But on August 21, 2020, the day of reckoning finally arrived. DeAngelo, now a 74-year-old man, stood in a makeshift courtroom in Sacramento State University's ballroom, converted due to the COVID-19 precautions. The air was thick with tension as survivors and family members of his victims gathered to witness justice being served. As the proceedings began, the weight of DeAngelo's crimes became evident. Prosecutor Tien Ho painted a chilling picture of the man before them.
His monikers reflect the sweeping geographical impact of his crimes. The Visalia ransacker, the East Area rapist, the original Night Stalker, and the Golden State Killer.
But it was the victims' impact statements that truly brought home the horror of DeAngelo's actions. For 3 days, survivors and family members took the stand, their voices trembling with emotion as they recounted their experiences. One survivor, Chris Pedretti, who was violated by DeAngelo when she was just 15, looked him in the eye and declared,
"I was a normal 15-year-old kid. I loved going to school, having sleepovers, and going to church."
Another victim, Patty Cosper, daughter of survivor Patricia Murphy, read a statement on her mother's behalf. "May he rot in hell," Cosper spat, her voice filled with decades of pain and anger. As the statements continued, a pattern emerged. DeAngelo's victims weren't just recounting their trauma, they were reclaiming their power. Each statement seemed to chip away at the monster's facade, revealing the coward beneath. Then came the moment everyone was waiting for. Judge Michael Bowman prepared to deliver the sentence. The courtroom held its breath. Would the punishment fit the crime? Could any sentence truly bring justice after so many years? Judge Bowman's voice rang out, clear and firm.
Another way to state the sentence is as follows. Mr. DeAngelo is sentenced to a total of 11 life without the possibility of parole sentences, plus an additional life sentence, plus an additional 8 years.
The reaction was immediate. A collective exhale swept through the room, followed by muffled sobs and whispers. Some victims clasped hands, others nodded solemnly. The monster who had haunted their nightmares for so long was finally caged. But the most surprising reaction came from DeAngelo himself. The man who had terrorized so many, who had eluded capture for decades, now sat slumped in his wheelchair. As the judge read out his crimes, DeAngelo's face remained impassive, almost bored. It was a stark contrast to the predator he once was. Then, in a move that stunned the courtroom, DeAngelo slowly rose from his wheelchair. He turned to face the gallery, his eyes scanning the faces of those he had hurt. For a moment, it seemed like he might finally show remorse, offer an explanation, or beg for forgiveness. Instead, in a barely audible voice, he uttered just 5 words.
"I've listened to all your statements, each one of them, and I'm truly sorry."
The reaction was mixed. Some saw it as a final insult, a half-hearted apology that couldn't begin to make up for the pain he'd caused. Others felt a sense of closure, finally hearing the killer acknowledge his crimes, even if only briefly. As DeAngelo was wheeled out of the courtroom to begin his life sentence, the atmosphere shifted. The monster was gone, but his legacy of pain remained. Yet there was also a sense of triumph. The survivors had faced their tormentor and emerged victorious. In the days following the sentencing, reactions continued to pour in. Law enforcement officials who had worked tirelessly on the case for years expressed relief and satisfaction. Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert called it the most prolific serial predator in California history, emphasizing the significance of the conviction. But perhaps the most poignant reactions came from the survivors themselves. Many spoke of a weight being lifted, of finally being able to close a chapter that had been left open for far too long.
No 13-year-old should have to find out what a rape kit is.
It had been all over the local news about the man they called the Visalia ransacker, who was breaking into people's houses, going through underwear drawers, and taking items of no value. I could never imagine that the man who had been stalking me and peering in my bedroom window during the previous months would end up changing my life forever.
He ate from my refrigerator and he drank 2 beers, while I lay bound and blindfolded, unclothed and freezing on the hardwood floor in front of an open door in the cold March night.
These 10 dirty cops face justice, but corruption runs deeper than you think. Stick around. Our next video exposes even more shocking betrayals.